The smell reached the fields before the sun did, a thick, bitter haze rising from the fire pits near the kitchen, if you could call it that. A few iron pots, blackened from years of use, sitting over open flames at the edge of the quarters. Whatever was cooking, it would have to last. There was no second meal. The system that governed enslaved people's food in 18th century America was built not around sustenance, but around calculation. Planters understood that a body without fuel could not work. So they fed, but just enough. Weekly rations were distributed with the same cold logic applied to livestock. A standard allotment on many plantations came down to roughly a peck of cornmeal and 3 to 4 pounds of salt pork per week. That was it. That was the week. Cornmeal became the center of almost every meal. It was ground coarse, often from the lowest quality grain set aside before the better stock was sold or stored for the planter's household. Enslaved cooks, and there were always cooks, because the labor of cooking fell almost entirely on women, learned to turn that rough meal into something that could fill a stomach. Hoe cakes pressed flat and cooked on the blade of a hoe over open coals, ash cakes wrapped in leaves and pushed directly into the fire, corn mush boiled thin and eaten from a shared pot. Every variation was a form of survival, dressed in the only ingredients that existed. Salt pork was the other constant, and it was rarely what it sounds like. What reached enslaved quarters was typically the parts the planter's table did not want. Fatback, pig ears, entrails, feet, scraps of organ meat swimming in brine so heavy the flesh had turned dense and almost grey. Enslaved people ate those cuts not because they were considered food by the broader society, but because there was nothing else. What emerged from necessity, the slow cooking of tougher cuts, the transformation of discarded animal parts into something edible, would eventually become one of the most distinctive culinary traditions in American history. The people who built that tradition were never credited for it. The act of eating was itself regulated by time. On most plantations, there was no formal break for a midday meal during peak seasons. Fieldwork ran from before dawn until after dark during harvest, and food, when it existed, was eaten in motion, standing, crouched beside a row. Children who were too young for field labor, but old enough to be useful, were often kept near the planter's house, eating scraps from the kitchen after the family had finished. Some planters deliberately fed enslaved children from a common trough, wooden or iron, as a way of reinforcing the idea that they occupied a different category of being. This was not accidental, it was policy. Hunger was chronic, not always the sharp, acute kind, but the low and constant kind that sits behind the eyes and slows the body and makes everything heavier than it should be. Nutritional deficiencies were widespread and documented by plantation records themselves, though rarely identified as such. Night blindness, a symptom of severe vitamin A deficiency, was common enough to be noted in some plantation logs as a routine observation, like weather or yield. Pellagra, caused by a lack of niacin and directly linked to corn-heavy diets without sufficient protein, produced skin lesions, confusion, and eventually death. It moved through enslaved communities with a silence that suited everyone who preferred not to investigate the cause. Against this backdrop, what enslaved people cultivated for themselves was an act of defiance measured in root and vine. Many plantations allowed small garden plots, not out of generosity, but because it reduced the cost of feeding people while maintaining the appearance of providing for them. On those small strips of land, behind the quarters or along unused edges of fields, enslaved people grew sweet potatoes, collard greens, cowpeas, okra, watermelon. These crops had deep roots in West and Central Africa, brought across the Atlantic not as seeds in a satchel, but as embedded knowledge: what to plant, how to tend it, when to harvest, how to cook it. That knowledge survived the crossing. The crops survived. The people carried them forward. Sunday was, in theory, a day without field labor on most plantations. In practice, it was the only margin of autonomy that existed in the week. Enslaved people used it to tend their gardens, to trade among themselves, and, in some regions, to sell small quantities of produce at informal markets. These exchanges were technically illegal in many states by the early 1800s, but they happened anyway, often with the tacit tolerance of local whites who found it economically convenient. The small coins earned, sometimes as little as a few cents, were saved for years toward purchasing fabric, shoes, or, in rare cases, freedom. Fishing was another thread in that same net of survival. Rivers and creeks that ran near plantations became a source of protein that existed outside the planters' control, if only slightly. Night fishing, done after the day's work in the hours that technically belonged to rest, brought catfish, perch, and eel to fires that had no business being lit at that hour. Trapping small game, foraging for berries, digging for roots, all of it happened in the narrow dark between sundown and the obligations of the next day. It was exhausting. It was also necessary. Sleep existed at the margins of every other demand. Enslaved quarters ranged from crude log structures with no windows and dirt floors to more permanent brick cabins on larger plantations, though permanent is a relative term when the people inside could be sold at any moment. In most cases, families shared a single room. A fireplace, if there was one, served for both heat and cooking. Pallets of corn husks or Spanish moss served as mattresses. Blankets, when distributed at all, were rough wool, issued once a year in the fall. The cold came through the walls. It always came through the walls. Overcrowding was the norm, not the exception. 6 to 10 people in a space designed, if designed at all, for storage. Quarters built close together, not for community, but for surveillance. Overseers' houses positioned with sightlines to the cabins. On some plantations, enslaved people were counted before sleep and after, like inventory being verified against a ledger, because that is precisely what they were in the legal framework of the time. Inventory. Assessed, insured, depreciated. In this system, illness was a complication of economics before it was a human concern. A sick enslaved person was a loss of labor, and planters tracked illness with the same attention they gave to crop yields. Medical records from large plantations in Virginia and South Carolina show common ailments listed without sentiment: fever, flux, sore eyes, worms. Treatment was minimal and often harmful: mercury-based purges, bloodletting, remedies applied with the same indifference used for sick cattle. Enslaved people with knowledge of medicinal plants, again, knowledge rooted in African tradition, often treated each other in ways that were more effective than what the planter's physician provided. That, too, was a form of resistance. The community that formed around the hearth in the evenings, after the work before the sleep, was one of the few spaces that existed outside complete control. Food was shared. Stories moved through the quarters in languages that were slowly being erased from official recognition, but survived in cadence, in phrase, in the names given to children. Religion, in its various blended forms, offered something that no ration system could replicate. The hours spent gathered around fires or in brush arbors on Sunday evenings were hours spent in a life that the plantation had not entirely claimed. Not yet, not fully. What enslaved people cooked, when they had the freedom to cook for themselves rather than for the planter's table, carried an architecture of meaning that the ration system was never designed to accommodate. A pot of slow-cooked greens with smoked meat. Sweet potatoes roasted in coals and eaten with nothing but the warmth of the fire. Rice prepared with techniques that required knowledge, the kind of knowledge passed hand to hand, generation to generation, surviving the violence of a system that had no interest in preserving it. These were not simply meals, they were continuity. They were the evidence that something essential had not been taken. By the late 18th century, the plantations of the American South were producing extraordinary wealth: cotton, tobacco, rice, indigo, goods that would move into global markets and fuel economies far beyond the borders of any single state. That wealth was built on a precise system of extraction, the maximum labor for the minimum sustenance. The people at the center of it ate what they were given, grew what they could, caught what was available, and cooked what remained into something that kept a body going through another day. The margin was always thin. The will to exist inside that margin was not. The fire died down late. Somewhere near the far end of the quarters, a child was being put to sleep, not by silence, but by a voice low enough to stay close. Outside, the fields waited in the dark, patient as they always were, already belonging to the next day that was already coming. Inside, something was still warm,